This is the Parallax podcast, and my name is Tom Amarque. In this mini-series, I interview the Swedish philosopher Alexander Bards on his worldview in general and his book Digital Libido in particular. Alexander Bards is a colorful character, being a proper philosopher, shaman, popstar, and entrepreneur. But as a shaman-philosopher, he looks deeply into our past, present, and future, laying out new narratives on the digital era, which is just now unfolding. In this 5-part mini-series, we will explore some of his core ideas. We start with a general introduction, followed by lectures on the relationship between man and technology, the phallus, spirituality, and power. In which sequence you listen to these episodes is completely up to you. This is a new format. I try to take a back seat and only facilitate guiding questions, so Alexander Bards had all the space to express and reveal his ideas. All the recordings took place in midst of the worldwide corona pandemic, which is quite obvious right now, but could create a context for the listeners in the years to come, because the internet won't forget. So, enjoy this mini-series, and if you indeed enjoyed it, please share it. Alexander Bards, you are now in the process of writing the 3rd part of your grand narrative trilogy. To start off this little mini-series, would you be so kind and summarize the overarching narrative and theme of this trilogy in general and of Digital Libido, which is the 2nd part of the trilogy in particular?
Okay, the first chapter in the first book of this trilogy was a synthesis, creating God in the internet age. The first chapter says everything is religion. So everything we human beings do is religion. And if you pretend it's not religion, then it's dangerous. So we better treat ourselves and what we do as religion. And what we mean by that is that we do look up to the elderly. We look up to people who are more experienced than ourselves for guidance in our lives. Children mimic their parents to become like their parents. And hopefully they become like their parents with a slight deviation so they can also be a bit different. But that's what it means to be a child. Now, grown-ups then in turn look up to their idols or icons or whatever for guidance on how they could be in their lives. And they look up hopefully to their own parents and the elderly for guidance. And eventually, this model means that in society we look up to the Ur-fathers and the Ur-mothers. We look up to those ahead of us, those who lived before us, for guidance how we're going to live our lives. That is what religion is all about. When we say the word God, that's just another name for Ur-father, or God is just another name for Ur-mother. These are just the people that were ahead of us or are hopefully walking behind us to support us. Corona.
No. No, thank you.
Okay, so religion is basically what human beings do. That is the basic narrative that we tell about ourselves. And it's a narrative that unites us as human beings. So whether you look at a clan or a tribe, or even a small family, all these communities that we human beings create, certainly nations and empires, all these different unities that we create have narratives about themselves. And to refer back to your own narrative about your own community is what religion is. And then you have rituals to practice that. You go through different phases in your life. You go from one stage to the next, etc. That is what religion is all about. The idea that religion is some kind of made-up story by some prophet 2,000 years ago who claimed that there was an old man sitting on a cloud staring at us all the time, ready to like anything we did because I had nothing better to do. It's just ridiculous. That was never religion in the first place. That's just an abbreviation. I mean, when Richard Dawkins attacks God, he just gets incredibly childish and infantile because it's like he doesn't even understand what religion is. So religion is the fundamental story about the human community. This is the story the human community tells about itself. And the priests are, of course, the guys who are supposed to tell this story. And then obviously older women tell it to children and things like that as well. That's the kindergarten version of the same story. But these are the narratives we tell about each other. So synthesis and creating God in the internet age essentially says that if God is the name of where we want to go rather than where we come from, which makes a lot more sense, then we can create God, and we're obviously doing it. So essentially what it's saying in the Synthesis book is that we started creating machines 10,000 years ago, we settled permanently. And what has happened since then is that we human beings have become more and more stupid. The machines have become more and more smart. And eventually technology is ready to take over the world, and we become slaves to technology. And probably we don't even mind, because finally we have a master that we could actually adhere to. So we are moving towards the creation of God, rather than looking at God as some kind of father figure that initially created us. And that's the thesis of the book. We present the history of metaphysics. We present the history of religion. We put this into perspective. We said the 4 different aspects of the divine, the void, existence itself, difference, and eventually the creation, the creativity in the future. So we just laid that. That's a groundwork for understanding religion and metaphysics fundamentally.
So it's about creating new narratives and, in a way, new futures.
You could even say that Synthesis could have been a handbook for people 10,000 years ago in how they eventually constructed religions and metaphysics anyway. Personally, I'm a Zoroastrian. I converted Zoroastrianism, which is both the original monotheistic religion, and it's also the forebear to Taoism, Buddhism, and the East. So it's just happens to be the one religion in the world that unifies all the other ones. And so I converted to Zoroastrianism 28 years ago. But my point with this is to understand religion fundamentally and how it operates. And it just means that we say we're not really among secular, we're bullshitting ourselves. It's just that we're adhering to religions like capitalism, individualism, nationalism, all kinds of religions, especially individualism is religion I'm very critical of, because it's actually not working very well. We all end up in a society with 8 billion people who are completely sort of locked up into a constant competition with one another. And if there's one thing a pandemic exposes, that doesn't make any sense to human beings, because during pandemics we have to help each other. That just proves we're not individuals. We're flock animals, thank God. So after we wrote Synthesis, what was needed for the second book, which is Digital Libido, Sex, Power, and Violence in the Network Society, is to explain that during a paradigm shift where we both change the way we communicate with each other, we change the way we store and process information on a massive scale, we change our perception of knowledge and how we find and process knowledge. Now, when we do all these things in such a radical way as you're doing right now, it's going to get really messy, because the whole old power structure will be built on trying to defend the old system, trying to defend the nation state as we knew it, trying to defend individualism as we knew it, trying to defend capitalism as we knew it, trying to defend old industry as we knew it, trying to defend academia like a monopoly on knowledge, which is ridiculous, right? So all these old institutions, because they know nothing better and because they're lazy and fat, they will sit and protest against the old. It's all about the streets of Paris versus Versailles all over again in 1789. Except it's dragged out. It's going to last some 50 to 100 years. It started already in the 1980s, and we're now moving into a span in the 2020s when this is going to explode. So these old systems are now up against the new, and the new doesn't even know what it's doing yet. It's not like the tech giants of Silicon Valley understand how powerful they are and understand why they got where they are and understand what to do with their current positions. They will start to make all kinds of mistakes. And that's what we warn about Digital Libido. It's not like the new is just going to come in and it's going to be clear opposition between the old and the new, and you can then side with the new and everything be over and done with. No, that's not how it works during a paradigm shift. It gets messy. And that means hopefully we can stay away from open violence, still debate stuff and things like that, but I don't guarantee this is going to happen. That's what the title of the book is, Sex, Power, and Violence in the Network Society. And why the sex word is in there is because sexuality is always the area in religion to remind us that we never arrive in a harmonious and a balanced place. Sexuality is the one thing about human beings, according to Freud, that constantly reminds us that we're constantly in a struggle. We're attracted to the ambivalent, not to the harmonious, and that's problematic, especially during a massive paradigm shift like the current one. So digital has only just started.
What do you mean with the book title Digital Libido exactly?
Digital libido means that, libido is the opposite of mortido in Freud. So what Freud is discussing is the death drive. It's that we want to die from the minute we're born. Well, obviously, when you were born, the first thing you wanted was to get back in. Okay, that's the birth of Mortido. You could also say you experience a kind of Mortido every night when you're tired and you go to bed because you just want to go to sleep. You're tired of that day, but since you expect to wake up the next morning, you're not terrified of going to sleep. It's not like you're going to die, but it's Mortido. Libido is what you hopefully experience in the morning when you wake up, get a cup of coffee. That helps. And suddenly you feel alive. You want to do stuff. You want to be alive, right? So libido is that within you that wants to live. It's a will towards life. And Mortido is that within you that would prefer to just go extinct and not have to live at all. Mortido, in a way, is so tired of living, it can't even kill itself. So it's like even suicide is too active for the Mortido, according to Freud. So there you go. But, you know, I'm describing libido and Mortido in the most extreme sense, but that's to understand the two words, because our lives are obviously a dialectical process between libido and Mortido constantly. So we're horny sometimes, libido, and then we're just tired, Mortido, right?
Okay, so what then is digital libido?
The digital libido is that which wants to live in a society where human beings and machines are becoming one thing with one another. So we're moving towards a very intimate relationship between man and machine. It's called symbiotic intelligence. And symbiotic intelligence, of course, another word for God. So what would be the optimal relationship between machine intelligence and human beings? That is obviously the God we discussed already, Syntheos, in the Synthesis book. In the Digital Libido book, we said, okay, so what if that optimal relationship is what we're moving towards? Now, how are we going to get there in the least bloody and least complicated way possible? And that's why Digital Libido is a book that both warns you about the current situation and also obviously lays out the framework for how you at least become an elite, a part of the elite in this new society we're moving into.
So let me ask a question. When I think about libido, I also associate things like life affirmation and battle with chaos and goal setting and danger and adventures, venturing into the world and optimism, all values that don't seem to be high on the value list of the postmodern world. So how do you imagine libido shifting into the realm of the digital, and how does it manifest there?
Yeah, postmodern is like the end of capitalism, the end of individualism, and the end of modernism, obviously. But what's problematic here, and doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with technology directly, is of course 1945. And with 1945, we finally got rid of Hitler and Stalin. Of course, Mao went on in China and did about the same horrors there for the next 20 years. But if you look at Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, what we discuss in Digital Libido is that they're phallic creatures, but they're false phalluses or fake phalluses. So we need to understand the difference between authentic phallus, who wants everything you just said, somebody who is immersed in libido properly and wants all these things, like an authentic phallus. What would a messianic figure look like? Well, a messianic figure in the sense an authentic phallus would be somebody who unites us around a common goal that we're going to reach. Let's say we walk out of Egypt towards the promised land. Well, then the promised land is the name of where we want to go. The fake phalluses, though, they take the short route and they unite the people by putting an object out there. So what we discuss in Digital Libido, we work with Julia Kristeva's work from France in the 1980s, and we work, of course, with Freud and Jung and Lacan. And we take psychoanalysis, and then we discuss and say that the objection is what's important here. So you either unify people by pointing out common enemy and say that, well, we're all different, but we have this one enemy in common. And because we hate this one enemy, say Hitler said it with the Jew, Stalin did it with the Kulak. Mao went so far as even to say, hate your parent, right? The worst of them all. So you find an objection, an object, and by objectify something, unite the people. The problem with that is that it will work tremendously well in a militant way for a short period of time. It will cause tons of havoc and will eventually fail. Because there is no promised land to reach. Eventually, everybody starts killing everybody in such a society, or it goes down. In this way, Adolf Hitler was doomed from the very beginning. If you look at Adolf Hitler's project, Nazism, It was nothing but a Gnostic death cult from the very beginning. If you read Mein Kampf and see what he actually did, and it took him 11 years, and then Germany went down and took half of Europe, where 100 million people died. It was the ultimate Gnostic death cult. And that's how these fake phallus have to be understood. But nobody made that analysis after 1945. So what happened was that we got out of everything that went wrong with modernism. The Frankfurt School did a terrific job in the 1930s in Germany. They were all Jews. They were all in Germany in the 1930s, like Walter Benjamin, Horace Madonna. And they warned us about this guy. And also Freud warned us about Hitler in the 1930s and basically said that it's all going to end up in heaven because this guy is a fake phallus. So we need to get back to an understanding of what an authentic phallus is. What is genuine, generous leadership? Phallic leadership. It doesn't exclude women any whatsoever, but normally we associate the phallic with either a masculine figure called the chieftain or with an androgynous figure called the priest. And in all the great mythologies, in all the major religions, there are actually three of these institutions. There's the chieftain, the priest, and the matriarch. And this is, of course, if you take the story of the Promised Land and the Exodus out of Egypt, you have Moses and Aaron. Sorry. You, of course, have, in the Exodus out of Egypt, you have Moses and Aaron and Miriam. At least in the Jewish version of the Exodus. You have the three siblings. And Moses, obviously, is the priest. Aaron is the chieftain. And Miriam is the matriarch. And this returns in religions constantly. You have the more androgynous figure of the priest. You have the more masculine figure of the chieftain, of course, the more feminine figure of the matriarch. And these are, of course, the elderly. These are the guys who will lead us into the future. The matriarch hold the two guys responsible. And the chieftain is, of course, the embodied version of leadership. And the priest is, of course, the spiritual leadership here. And this is what's necessary in any religion to make it work. And if you look at it that way, you discover that what's wrong with all the fake phalluses, like Hitler and Stalin out, is that they try to unify the priest and chieftain into one figure. That's the dictator or the tyrant. The tyrant is always a fake phallus. Right. Because the phallus itself is a function that has to be split between the chieftain and the priest. So there's one guy who controls the symbolic, and that's the priest. And there's one guy who controls the imaginary, and that is the chieftain. And of course, the matriarch controls the real because she controls reproduction. She controls the future. She controls, that's where women give birth to children. That's ultimately the delivery station of the whole tribe. So the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real Lacan is repeated in religion. It's repeated in this, what we call the nomadological structure. And this nomadological structure, of course, you can even find it in the American Constitution. That's why it's so brilliant. You have the American president, you have the American Congress, and you have the Supreme Court. That's, again, the chieftain, the priest, and the matriarch. These three functions are constantly repeated.
So how do these roles translate in a healthy way into the digital world?
We have to find all three. So don't believe anybody out there claims to be all three or only two of them and then disqualifies the third one. Remember why the American Constitution has worked so well and probably will save the United States of America this century too, simply because it has the Constitution. And it saved Judaism for the last 3,000 years. It's built into Zoroastrianism. It's built into all the major things that will survive whatever we have. It's also the best part of Christianity. Christianity pretends it's a trinity with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, but it's really the Father, the Son, and the Mother. Anybody who's a devout Catholic knows it's about the Father, the Son, and the Mother, right? So it's constant, this structure is being repeated. So I would say that an autocracy has to be split into three. And only when we have all three functions of an autocracy in place can we finally start seeing a map or where technology could be heading in a constructive way. And the warning right now is not to go with the Chinese version of this, which is basically to have one dictator, currently Xi Jinping, who rules the Communist Party of China, and all power goes to him to control the entire world, meaning he should control at least 1.4 billion Chinese people every day by having sensors locked into their lives, into their everyday lives, and thereby controlling all of them. It's a complete horror. It's a complete terror. So we must get out of that. And what we owe the Chinese, because they're moving ahead at such a rapid pace right now, we owe them a response to the idea that the sensocracy they want to create will be most efficient as a dictatorship. And the funny thing here is that a dictatorship cannot be creative. Because to be creative, you have to have the triad in place. is precisely when chieftain and priest and matriarchs are split and you have different responsibilities within the community, that community thrives. And what I'm interested in doing now for the third book we're working on, John Söderqvist and I, is especially to look into the mind of the engineers of history, like the guys who have been the most constructive, because we also have to build ourselves out of the current climate crisis, and out of the current financial crisis, and out of probably the pandemic crisis and everything. The only way to approach these crises is through more technology. And that's why our hope is actually to the engineers of the world. And the engineers must not work for a dictator. The engineers must rather feel that there's a matriarch who they ultimately will deliver to, that there's a chieftain who will inspire them to build great stuff, and there's a priest there who will inspire them to build the narratives. How these two things are connected.
So the third part of the trilogy will be about the societal structures.
Yeah, so the third part of the book, the working title is Process and Event, but we'll see if that stays. But it could have been the nomadology too. But nomadology is basically the original story of human beings that we developed over the 60 or 70,000 years when we lived in nomadic tribes that were almost identical over that period. Our entire human genetic makeup comes from that period. Civilization is only somewhat 8,000 years old. In most places, only 100 years old. We have never been civilized. You know, it's just like Bruno Latour wrote a book called We Were Never Moderns. The honest way to approach postmodern is to say that we were never moderns in the first place. Human beings have been the same all along, and we haven't really changed that much during civilization. And we're still trying to cope with the fact that we built a world where we're all tied together. This world has become globalized. We can have our own local religions on the lower level, but we need a global religion on the global level that ties us all together. And this global religion we propose in our work started with synthism, developed in Digital Libido, and now we're going to develop it further in the third book. In the Grand Narrative Trilogy, it's all about this one grand narrative that can unite the planet. So how would that narrative work? Well, we've had successful empires in the past, and the one we're mostly focused on is the Persian Empire because it lasted for over 1,400 years. And it's the empire that the Romans and the Chinese and Indians and others eventually copied. So it's the best model we have for empire ever. We're also working with the Jewish religion because the Jewish nation is actually the original nation in human history and still the most successful nation ever. So I think for nationalism, I think actually Judaism is a good place to go. And we're trying to map these different narratives that already exist and then use them as inspiration for creating these different levels of narratives that we need to create. And not only do we need a global narrative, and we can still have local narratives, and the global narrative is one of tolerance and multitude because we're going to have local narratives on another level, but it's also a story today about how you're going to create stories on top of the two that we had before. Nomadology is the original one, but what we did do since we created civilization is the eventology that you and I talked about before. And this is the idea of not circular time, that everything is repeated, the way you see things in India and China most of the time, but eventology is the idea that actually the son can be different from the father. One generation can improve the work of the previous one. And this is, of course, the idea that arises with written language and information storage 8,000 years ago. And with that, we have a history of eventology, started with Zoroastrianism. We have Judaism eventually. Then we have some what I call the inferior versions that were more popular, like Islam and Christianity. But we have all these different ideas in the past that the world can be better than it once was. And that's called eventology. So we need both an eventology and a nomadology. We need both the story of everything always returns to the same, because biologically that's what happens to us human beings. But we also need to start how we can improve on things and make the world better, and also work on the problems we have in the world today and solve those problems. And without the eventology, we will never solve problems like the climate crisis.
Right.
So we need the eventology as well.
So while part 3 of the trilogy is more about the societal narratives, a concept you frequently use in part 2, Digital Libido, is that of the individual, a concept that was first introduced by Deleuze. In context of this concept of the individual, what would be the main challenges and possibilities of a more phallic life while we are moving into the digital?
you pointed it out. We have to be both phallic and matrical. So matrical is anything that has to do with the female body in our fantasy. So it's like the womb, and we call the matrix, and then of course the tit, which is called mamilla. And this is where we come from. This is where we stayed the first day of our lives. We couldn't imagine anything else. And anything that we associate today with safety, for example, once you come home to your own home, you take a bath, you go to your bed, you stay with your friends or your family. All those things that make us safe and feel protected are associated with the female body. And this is the matrical realm. This is half of human society in a given time, at least half of it. We call it the inner circuit in Digital Libido. So we just state first that has to be there. And that's, of course, intimately tied to nomadology. Then the eventology, the idea that we can go out in the world and change the world for the better, really starts with the fact there's an outer circle that most men live. And the outer circle is, of course, the realm of warfare and hunting and all those things. And, of course, we couldn't survive without it. This protects us from the outside world, but the outer circuit is also where deliver most of the food comes from. That's where we get the protein from, so we can survive it. You know, the breast has to be fed so the breast can deliver milk to the baby. And when the child realizes this is about 1 year of age, that somebody's feeding the mother's body so the mother can give him milk, that's when the child is ready to leave the breast, the mamilla, and start eating on its own and try to become phallic one day. So the phallus represents what we're moving towards, whereas matrix represents where we come from. Remember that these things are on a par with one another. When we say a phallic world, that we need to reinstate phallus again, is because it's lacking in today's society, because we've ended up with a society so dominated by the matrical that we completely lost out on the phallic. And we know historically why that happened. It happened because modernism eventually failed, because modernism ended up with the Second World War and hundreds of millions of people dead. And it ended up with the technology that almost destroyed the planet, which we lived with for the last 30 years. And of course, we now live in a society that sort of thinks that if we only stay with the matrix, everything will be fine. But that's the total lie. That's the ultimate lie. And that usually is the beginning of the really bloody periods in history where it gets really bad. We have to remember that the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s was exactly like the state of things are now. So that's when the real tyrants rear their ugly heads. They always come out when the phallus is ignored, when we ignore the phallic energy, when we ignore libido as such in society and try to just wipe it away, pretend it doesn't exist. That's when the ascetics dominate the world. That's when the little boys start dominating the world, who want to impress their mothers. And that's where we have to move.
So what we basically are having now.
Yeah, exactly what we have now, except for engineering and technology. But the problem with the technology industry has been dominated by little boys instead of elderly men. So I think where technology will have to move in the 2020s is that people are more respectable, who maybe are in the 60s and 70s, but they're savvy with technology, will take over and run a large part of technology. And I don't mean politicians. For God's sake, keep politics out of this. But I think people who are savvy with engineering and technology and understand what we can actually do with machine intelligence, we can actually do with these machines to help humanity forward. Okay, that has to be the next wave of technology. I think the 2020s could provide it. As we write books about it, and this exactly is what we point out in Digital Libido, is that we say that those who take on to the authentic phallus as an ideal to lead us forward to the promised land. The promised land is a sustainable planet with sustainable cities, with sustainable communities that live in peace with one another and trade with one another, and that have systems in place that can, for example, stop pandemics and financial crises when they do happen. So this will require enormous amounts of machine intelligence. We human beings cannot solve this on our own. And that's why we're saying explicitly in the Grand Narrative Trilogy, we will need God. This is not an option for us to create God because we want God to exist. This is an absolute necessity for us to survive as a species. Right. Human beings have to be complemented with even more technology in the past. And it's not just good enough that telepathy became a smartphone one day. We need much more technology actually to solve the problems we have ahead of us. That's the message.
So in the run of this mini-series, we will delve into several key aspects and topics of your thinking. Namely technology, phallus, spirituality, and power. But if there's one thing the listener can take away right now, for example, if he doesn't have the time to listen to all of these episodes, what would you tell him? What would you say? What would be a key insight and perspective of all of it?
Okay, so I would say read Nietzsche and then think, what would Nietzsche say about digital? Because that's where I work. And I don't mind Karl Marx, and I don't mind that whatever wealth we can create in the future, sort of attentional wealth, as we call it, from the internet, can be distributed to more people. But right now, we need to point out who are going to be the elite and the society move into. And then once we have an elite, because human beings can mimic, as we repeatedly say in our work, then we have models, role models for people to copy and say, oh, I can be like that. I could be like that. Just look at technology, okay? We had all these brats who were great at creating innovative stuff, and they created Silicon Valley. And then other brats came along. Well, that period is probably over by now. And the next generation of people who run the major technology companies of the world and try to keep politics and try to keep capitalism out of these systems so we can keep the algorithms clean, will have to look to something more Nietzschean. So I would say, if you can keep the algorithms clean, and we can keep money away from corrupting them, and we can keep politics away from manipulating them, then the algorithms will be incredibly powerful for us to use. And I would just give you advice is to go back and create your own private personal algorithm.
What do you mean by that, creating your own personal algorithm?
If you use YouTube, if you use Spotify, you discover that your algorithm is becoming more and more personal. So any tool you use your computer, any tool you use your laptop, any tool you use your smartphone, it's becoming more and more personal, right? So it's becoming your own guardian angel. It's like you're having a spirit next to you that's there to protect you and give you advice and also challenge you when you need to. So if you like to be challenged, you behave in a way that you like to be challenged, your algorithm will keep challenging you. But if you want to have something very protective and you don't want to hear anything you don't like, your algorithm will end up as nothing but an echo chamber. You become stupid. So your algorithm will reflect how much you dare to challenge yourself. And the more you dare to challenge yourself now, the more powerful you'll be, the more interesting you'll be, the more knowledgeable you'll be, the more other people would like to network with you. Because if you only want to stay within the same realm and never learn anything new and only hear the same repetition of the same all the time, you're going to be stupid. So right now, by looking at your own personal algorithm, you can decide if you want to be a Nietzschean Ubermensch, or if you just want to be a slave. Then later, when we have some masters here, and we do already, YouTubers, for example, are masters already of this universe, but once you have some masters of this universe out there, they will start connecting with each other and creating you elite. They will find you if you're talented. But right now, what we want to teach everybody out there is that if you look at your own personal algorithm, and if your personal algorithm challenges in a great way, so you build all the time, you feel you're expanded all the time, you learn stuff all the time, then you're in a good place, then you're doing the right thing with your own interest.
Okay, so last question here. Are you implying with that it would be imperative to create the own narratives, to play my own game, not playing the game of another person, or not comparing myself to others, but to myself and, for example, my growth?
Internet use. Your algorithm will spot what kind of person you are, and then it will start mapping other people that are like you. And suddenly, for example, on Spotify, you get tips about songs you actually love, because the algorithm has already figured out that you have a certain musical taste, and it's already found out the people you don't even know yet out there in the world who have your taste. And eventually, of course, the algorithm might ask you and the other person, would you like to connect with each other? Because you're so similar in so many ways, you can actually be great friends here. Or you're so dissimilar in so interesting ways, you could be great antagonists of one another and challenge one another. Now, this is what algorithms will do. Now, I don't trust the tech giants that have provided the algorithms today to give us the proper algorithms of the future. And that's why Söderqvist and I in our work are celebrating hackers as much as we do. We're celebrating open source all the time as much as we do, because you believe that the hard drives you have today can also create a kind of a guerrilla environment where, in case the big tech giants fall for politics or fall for the money of capitalism, and they get corrupt and they get manipulated, and they start to control you, then you need the free new open algorithms that we desperately want. China is a perfect example for that. It's impossible in China today to get a free and open algorithm, because the algorithms are controlled by millions of controllers who work with Xi Jinping. And then you go to Hong Kong, especially to Taiwan, you discover the same people, Chinese people, they live in a free and open society. They're much smarter. They're much more ahead of the mainland Chinese people. You know, their standard of living is way higher. They're much more creative because they live in a society with free and open algorithms. And of course, Taiwan today has probably more hackers than any other place on the planet. I love those environments because I believe that what is absolutely crucial today is that we understand that the internet so far has been built by tech giants that weren't ready for what they created. And then at the end of the game, around the end of the game is going to be what we do as users. You and I already are matching our algorithms whether we know it or not, because we have so much similar tastes and interests that you and I are already affecting each other's algorithms. So an algorithm is the perfect example of a individual. It is like your guardian angel. It's like a spirit that follows you, but you ultimately decide whether your personal algorithm will challenge you or will just tell you flattering things.
Right.
And I think after Facebook, once it's over now and done, and we don't want any of the scrolling and the trolling anymore, we're just tired of something flattering us all the time and giving us likes all the time. What finally feels like eerie, like you're part of a Ponzi scheme that just tries to flatter you all the time. Just like, no, I don't want any more of the flattering. I want somebody to challenge me. And that's exactly ready to move into a proper netocracy.
Alexander, thank you very much for these introductory words. I'm really looking forward doing this mini-series.
Yes, same to you.